Hello, welcome. Please take your seats. Yes, thank you so much again for coming. My name is Aviva Abramovsky. It is my privilege and honor to be Dean of the University of Buffalo School of Law and to begin our introduction for our distinguished Mitchell Lecturer, Professor John Braithwaite. So welcome to our 2018 James McCormick Mitchell Lecture on Tempered Power, Variegated Capitalism, Law, and Society. We are pleased to have Professor John Braithwaite here with us to discuss how law can deal effectively with the variable kinds of capitalism that organize our world today. I'm looking forward to it personally. The Mitchell Lecture, I'm going to give you a little bit of history, has been a celebrated tradition here at the law school since its inception in 1951. It was the law school's only endowed lecture series and has consistently been one of the academic highlights of each year. James McCormick Mitchell graduated in 1897 from what was then known as Buffalo Law School. He remained actively engaged in the law school after he graduated. In the early 1900s, along with several other alumni and friends, he helped to fund the scholar's first law library. Up until then, law students had access to the 8th Judicial Circuit Court's District Law Library, but this school did not have its own collection. 5 years later, the school's law library housed between 4,000 and 5,000 volumes. And as you see today, we have really come a long way in this beautiful space in our law library here. I actually want a round of applause for all the librarians who worked so hard to get this done. Thank you so much. I always joke around with people that it's my hope to get students into the library. They might read something. No. Mitchell went on to serve as chairman of the Council of the University of Buffalo, then a private institution, where he led the advisory body and provided guidance to the university's leadership on academic, student, and financial matters. Upon his death in 1948, his wife, Lavinia Mitchell, donated $28,000 in memory of her husband to memorialize his commitment to the advancement of education and to enable the student body to hear a prominent lecture each and every year. The first lecture was held on May 9, 1951, and was given by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, one of our own local boys and heroes. It was entitled Wartime Security and Liberty Under Law, proving that we have been topical for well over 60 years. The lecture was published that year in the first issue of the Buffalo Law Review. Since then, we have presented a series of lectures on some of the most timely topics of law, presented by an exceptionally impressive list of speakers, including but not limited to Derek Bell of Harvard Law School, Irene Zubaydah Khan, who served as the 7th Secretary General of Amnesty International, the famous Richard Posner, a leader in the field of law and economics, and John Balkin, a pioneer in the field of technology and constitutional law. We're happy to welcome Professor John Braithwaite to this list of distinguished speakers. This is also a very special year for another reason. It is the Baldy Center for Law and Society is celebrating its 40th year. So you are not just our keynote Mitchell Lecture, you are our anniversary speaker, and we'll be hosting a related conference tomorrow on tempering power in a variety of contexts. To tell you more about the Baldy Center's anniversary and to more personally introduce our speaker, I am pleased to welcome Professor Errol Medinger to the stage, director of the Baldy Center and a member of the organizing committee for this lecture. And it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you so much.
Good job. Okay. Thank you, Aviva. As Dean Abramovsky said, this is the 40th anniversary of the Baldy Center, and we decided to link the anniversary of the Baldy Center, one of our venerable institutions, to the Mitchell Lecture, one of our other venerable institutions, and to hold a Baldy conference in conjunction with the lecture, thereby leveraging our joint resources, multiplying our resources. This is a great opportunity, but it was an organizationally fairly challenging one. And before I go on with the program, I want to thank some of the people who've been instrumental in carrying it out. The faculty members on the planning committee included Matt Stylen, who served as a chair. I'm filling in for him today because he can't be here because he's presenting his own work at the American Society for Legal History. Anya Bernstein, David Engel, Matteo Tossig-Rubo, and myself. Now, so we did the thinking about who to invite and how to do it, but the main people who turned these plans into reality are Lisa Mueller, Vice Dean for Communications at the law school, who handled many of the external and internal arrangements, Terrence McCormick, who the Associate Director of the Law Library, who handled the arrangements for putting this room together, getting all this tech, checking the many lists that had to be checked, and who, along with Dean Abramofsky, suggested that we might want to hold this event in the library. And so Terry has been very important. And Laura Worth, the Assistant Director at the Baldy Center, who, along with the Baldy staff, did the hard work of making all of the logistical arrangements for the speakers and conference participants, as well as for the lecture, the reception, the conference. These three worked as a team and got it all done, for which they deserve much appreciation. Now, the program will be simple. We'll have a lecture. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, and we welcome that. John welcomes that. He's stressed to me several times how much he's looking forward to comments, to suggestions, and so on. And then we'll have a reception at the back of the library here, which will be a Baldy reception in part for the Baldy anniversary. There will be food and drink there, as there should be, especially as winter has come to greet us. We need rewards for coming in, and copies of the just published history of the Baldy Center for those who want them. And our author of that history, Luke Hamill, will be there to even inscribe a copy for you. You may have a valuable first edition. So, bear that in mind. All right, so for a very long time, going back at least to the late 1930s, this law school has welcomed fresh and often quite critical perspectives on law, legal institutions, legislatures, courts, lawyers, whatever, and so on. And the Baldy Center, in a way, continues and institutionalizes that tradition. Its mission is to advance interdisciplinary research on law, legal institutions, and social policy, and their implications for social policy, I guess I should say, and thus to see law and legal institutions from perspectives that were unbound from the normative and methodological constraints of traditional legal scholarship, connected to them, but not limited to them. It's done so in a great many ways, sponsoring countless research projects, conferences, lectures, workshops, other initiatives over the years. Many of the Mitchell lectures, of course, did the same. We all remember our favorite Mitchell lectures. Mine was when I was a young faculty member here. That was once the case in 1984. And it was a session on feminist legal theory. It's still, I can still see it. It was very important to the advancement of my thinking and many of our colleagues. So the committee wanted to do the same this year. So we looked for someone who is deeply knowledgeable about law and also creatively able to place law and legal institutions in a critical social context and imaginatively think about how they might develop over time. And so we talked about a number of potential speakers, but when we discussed John Braithwaite, things just fell into place. Agreement came quickly. And then when I called, or I guess I emailed John, and then we talked, amazingly he said yes. And he said yes despite his manifold commitments, impending grandchildren who have now arrived, and so we set the date, and the grandchildren were kindly on time. So, we set the date with that in mind. And so I'm very, very pleased to welcome John as this year's Mitchell lecturer. John's a distinguished professor at Australian National University in Canberra, and he is distinguished. He's a prodigious scholar. So I like to think of myself as empirical, so I was going to count up all of his works, but it got too time-consuming. So I just went back to 2000. And in that time, by my count, he's published about 159 articles and chapters, So, you could do better. That's not quite 10 per year, John. And about 16 books. And on a wide range, these are on a wide range of topics. Just in the past 2 years, he's published a book on the minor problem of war and peace, called Cascades of Violence: War, Crime, and Peace Building Across South Asia. He's published an article on nonviolent resistance in Kosovo. He's written about crime, as he has all his career, minimally sufficient deterrence, democratic criminal justice, restorative justice, criminal justice that revives Republican democracy, and about state crime, in a beautifully titled article, The Best Way to Rob a Bank. And then about regulation and governance, which is the field in which I got to know him. Things like responsive excellence. And of course, for John, they're all related. And he can somehow range across this domain and incisively discuss it. And I'm speculating here, but I think John is interested in them all just because fundamentally he's interested in a just society that protects freedom and minimizes domination. And these are all a part of it. Now he didn't just write a huge amount of stuff, but people do read it. He has over 40,000 Google Scholar citations. That is, for those of you who haven't looked, that's a really big number. So anyway, I got to know him because of his work on regulation. And he's one of the sort of inventors of something called responsive regulation, which was a reaction to kind of an overly legalistic state versus economy model that had reached us in the 1970s. And John, like a number of others of us, wanted to see it in its greater complexity. He realized, he argued from the outset that regulation is not just rules, it's relationships, that it's dynamic, that it has to be understood as a process, not a matrix, or as he sometimes says, a storybook and not a rule book. And that only in that way can it be responsive, can it adapt to the differences and the challenges, the differences in space and over time and the challenges they pose. He worked with Ian Ayres, a Yale legal economist, to develop an argument that also persuaded some of the old-timers who did game theory and efficiency theory, a major work in the field, responsive regulation. But John is more committed to effectiveness than theory. He draws, and I think you'll see this when he speaks, he draws on whatever theoretical tradition helps. Could be game theory, could be restorative justice, could be Republican theory, could be Shaman reintegration, deliberative democracy, social imaginaries, they're all there. I guess when I read his work, I realize you really should be an American pragmatist. Just what works. He's really a member of the pragmatist tradition. So I won't go on about this, but I want to give you a sense of the particular dimensions of his stature and his importance in the world of scholarship. I also just want to note, though, that he's not just been a scholar. He's been an institution builder. He was a founder of RegNet, which is started out, as I remembered, as a group of like-minded scholars in Australia. They quickly became, I would say, the best in the world at what they did, and probably still are. That's now a school and produces all kinds of degrees and PhD students and so on at Australian National University. And he's always been an activist, and I think that's maybe why he's flexible about his theoretical perspective. He just wants to know what works, and so his activism goes from anti-poverty work as a teenager, being a life member of the Australian Labor Party, major actor in the consumer movement in Australia for a couple of decades, the peace movement, and He's increasingly involved in peace processes. So far as I know, what little I know about what he's up to, but I will tell you, next week he's going to Iraq to, so he's traveling from Buffalo to Iraq to work on peace-building issues there. So, without any further babble from me, please welcome John Braithwaite.
Well, thank you to the Dean and the Director for such a kind introduction. I got to say, Errol was a bit too kind. When I first met him more than 30 years ago, he was a highly skilled quantitative scholar publishing books on time series analysis, among other things. But, today some of those skills have clearly eroded because, there's some sort of miscount happened there with my publications. I haven't published 16 books, I'm sorry. Disappoint since 2000, not since 2000, no. So I'm slowing down. In fact, I'm pleased to report that it's a great honour to be here with you and to be the Mitchell lecturer at this great law school. And it's been lovely, not only for me, but for I'm sure I speak on behalf of the other international visitors to have enjoyed the wonderful hospitality that we've had since we've arrived. People have been very kind to us and very, very well organised, and made it just a pleasure to visit you. Well, it's a great occasion too. Here at this law school is a mothership of the Law and Society movement, and I was very impressed with Luke Hamill's historical report that we'll be launching a bit later on the history of the Baldy Centre. I know that there are representatives of one particularly important mothership, Wisconsin Law School, here today, but certainly, as Luke's wonderful document reveals, the early events that were organised here under the deanship of Red Schwartz. So, I remember one moment of Luke talking about that early meeting in 1975, I think, where Lon Fuller and others, there's only 100 people at the Law and Society meeting here at SUNY Buffalo, and the Dean, Red Schwartz, is able to have them all around to his home for a reception afterwards. So how things have grown. This lecture focuses more specifically on the Baldy Centre role from its inception, really, as a founder of the socio-legal tradition of regulatory studies, which I'm wanting to conceive here as a steering of the concentrations of power. The diversity of Baldy interdisciplinary scholarships really offers us a galaxy of gems of insight for my project as set out in the written paper, which I'm hoping might be accepted by the Buffalo Law Review. This includes a knowledge of critical legal studies, private enforcement of environmental laws, relational rights enforcement, Buddhist law and compassion, and insights on regulatory communities and regulatory cultures. Then there's the more encompassing Baldy contribution of strengthening our capacity to focus both the law and society lens and the regulatory lens, and valuable lenses they've proved to be in the hands of so many Baldy scholars over these past 40 years. In my essay, I use insights from the fields of knowledge collected at Baldy to set out how to temper power and how to transform bad power in a society through good power. This is a non-linear art which is partly a sort of jiu-jitsu of using power against itself. In contemporary conditions where power has shifted so greatly from states to capital, it's necessarily an art of responsiveness to variegations of capitalism. I illustrate these ideas through the specific challenges of tempering the power of finance and internet capital and accomplishing conditions of fair work. I argue that unless these challenges of tempering power are met, globally liberal capitalism will continue to lose influence, not to the communism it long feared, but to authoritarian capitalism. Inadequate regulation of finance, unfair labour practices, and crumbling environmental governance pose existential threats to liberal capitalism, indeed to our survival as a species. Baldy's work on law, Buddhism and social change, led by former director Rebecca French, may seem esoteric, though not for those who come from Buddhist societies, and not for the subject of my written essay. When the Dalai Lama spoke here in this library, I think, at Baldy in 2006, his theme was compassion in the implementation of law and responsive attention to context in law's implementation. I read that contribution as one about compassion and context in the tempering of power, a craft the Dalai Lama lovingly masters. His insights have applications beyond the field of immediate influence and are used in my essay to show how relational justice and compassionate tempering of power can be used in struggles to regulate variegated capitalism. One of my favourite pieces of research work from Baldy is on how relational law can temper power in David Engel and Frank Munger on disability rights, showing that in America, reputationally, a homeland of adversarial legal formalism, disability rights law has transformed the lives of disabled people for the better. Yet in Engel and Munger's empirical sample, no disabled person ever resorted to litigation to enforce their new rights. Rather, what happened was that the college student in a wheelchair could pitch an appeal for relational justice to her dean. She would appeal to the dean's compassion as she invoked informally her new legal right to a ramp to access a building. America's ramp arrived. New rights were vindicated across your country through relational power and compassionate strength. Social justice was transformed through many such decisive moments of assertion. My written essay argues a counterintuitive case for compassion and relational justice in regulating the excesses of Wall Street. Yet my argument is premised on the belief that this can only succeed if two conditions are met. First, if such justice is responsive to the new variegations in capitalism I'll discuss, and second, if a sword of Damocles stands behind that relational and compassionate justice to take decisive action in the case and the courts at the moment of exception. By binding business back together with the people through justice, capitalism can be more sustainable and make more money in the long run. We can appeal to Wall Street in strategic regulatory conversations by appealing to their compassionate interest in leaving the society better for their grandchildren. The alternative we can put that to them is that more or even worse events than those that occurred in 2008 will one day leave their society and their banks in ruins. Martin Krieger has elaborated some persuasive arguments about abuse of power that render ideals such as limiting or curbing power less appealing than tempering power. So he's the author of this concept. Power is a good thing. It's needed to enforce legal judgments, to keep the peace, to raise funds to build schools and hospitals. It's untempered power that is bad because it is arbitrary power. power that is tempered by the rule of law's discipline and by other checks in a separation of powers is more resilient. It grows authority that can be distinguished from domination. Domination is untempered, arbitrary power. Domination, as opposed to tempered power, struggles to build long-run legitimacy and the trust so vital to contemporary economies. For Krieger and for ancient Greek philosophers who advanced temperance as a virtue, temperance means a moderating balance of elements. For example, justice balanced with compassion. Tempered steel is made tougher, less hard, less brittle as an alloy, a balance of more resilient metals in a test of extreme heat. For Krieger, this tempering metaphor in governance means tempered power is less brutal, less brittle, because arbitrary power in pursuit of whims is constrained by rule of law in a way that untempered power is not. Using the example of constitutions, Krieger quotes Stephen Holmes on the error of seeing constitutions only as a restraint on power. Constitutions are also empowering in that they enable concentrations of power for good purposes. A republic is an unfinished struggle toward a polity where each separated power has sufficient clout to exercise its own functions with support from other separated powers. No one centre of power is so dominant that it can crush any other separated power without the other separated powers mobilising to push back that domination. Republicanism does not require powers that are so diffused that separated powers cannot act decisively. The executive is empowered to declare war, the judge to declare guilt, the legislature to declare laws, electoral commissions to declare election outcomes. Decisiveness for a constable on the street, for example, is knowing that she is the one with the power to decide whether to arrest a judge who appears to assault his wife. Of course, a mature constitutional debate is needed to fine-tune separated powers to ensure that each can decisively perform its function without domination from any centralising power and without confusion as to which institution exercises a separated power and under what norms, and without gridlock. The global financial crisis was not caused by a failure of the traditional tripartite separation of powers in the public sector, but by a failure of powers to be sufficiently separated within the private sector. One example was a failure of the ratings agencies to call the big institutions of capitalism to account. There were also failures of public branches of power to be sufficiently separated from Wall Street power. Clifford Shearing and Philip Stenning wrote an interesting article about Disney World in 1983, I think it was, and its argument was that children, as they go about the business of playing on the various devices at Disney World, are not regulated by punishing children who do things that would put them in danger. It's not done by educating children about the norms of safe conduct at Disney World. Rather, the children are regulated architecturally by channeling them with bars and by wrapping bars around them when they sit in these entertainment machines, so it's impossible for them to stand up when they shouldn't or get their arms ripped off by pulling them out from under the bars that architecturally constrain them. At the time, that seemed like a quaint, exotic work, but after the rise of Silicon Valley capitalism, what Lawrence Lessig called architectural regulation became quite dominant. Microsoft, Google, Facebook came to architecturally regulate us through the internet. They steer how events flow through our lives. Tech giants steer us to their favoured software products. They steer us to their customised news services, to products that pay a premium, to jump to the head of the queue in search engines. They're harnessed by clever Russian intelligence operatives. They're harnessed by the National Security Agency programs with vivid code names like Muscular and Prism that monitor our movements. Spookiness is the business model of this stalker economy in cyberspace. It's a variegation of capitalism that gives us a lot of free stuff if we agree to be tracked. Former Baldy student fellow Natasha Tushikov has brilliantly dissected this new regulatory challenge. She shows how networking generates troves of data that can be exploited by advertisers, pornographers, and the deep state alike. So enmeshed are the connections between the national security state and internet capital that Eisenhower's threat of the military-industrial complex is now surpassed by a deep state Silicon Valley complex, in an information siphoning intelligence complex. Tushikov illustrates the potential for architectural self-regulation of cyberspace at choke points, the title of her book, which I think has not yet arrived in your Baldy office. It may not be quite out yet. Choke books are where global internet firms exert control for the commercial purpose of catching people who purloin intellectual property. How does the largely American state regulation to accomplish this choke point self-regulation work? It's mostly through conversations with the internet giants. It works by an architecture of the internet giants controlling flows of information at choke points, tracking down counterfeiters, blocking their access to vital commercial and technical services at those choke points, and disabling websites by counterfeiters. Political leaders captured by intellectual property interests and by the deep state grant considerably untempered powers to these gatekeepers of cyberspace. Even when Facebook does good, it does bad because of the untempered quality of its hegemony. While it may be good that Facebook seeks to stop advocacy of Islamic terrorism on the internet, it threatens freedom when that script allows it to be co-opted by the government of India, for example, to crush free speech among Muslims in Kashmir, protesting the very real tyranny and denial of human rights they suffer at the hands of the Indian state. Who guards these guardians? Sadly, only invisible deep states. Do citizens have a say in gatekeeping decisions about what does and does not cross the line into child pornography? Who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter? What is obscenity and what is art? What is counterfeiting and what is life-saving production of legal generic drugs? No. Tushikov shows that choke point regulation is powerful architectural regulation without law and without democratic accountability of any meaningful kind. Not only that, the rule of men can mean men in trench coats from just two states, the US and UK, with the Russian and Chinese men in trench coats occasionally barging in. They rule over the citizens of almost 200 other states. In other words, states that benefit from the highest levels of expansive intellectual property monopoly rights are the rule makers. As citizens of states with an interest in less monopoly are rule takers, ruled by what she calls secret handshake deals and by monopolists between executives of the US state and its internet giants, happen precisely because laws in the US Congress to achieve the same result ran up against massive citizens' protests inside the US and globally. I refer to the incident where even Wikipedia and Google were shut down in those protest movements. Tushikov's insight is that a major new variegation of capitalism can grow quickly to include the wealthiest corporations on the planet. Completely new modalities of regulation can spring up that have a certain effectiveness but that are arbitrary power with no legal underpinning. These new forms of regulation work globally simply as relational regulation backed by coercive capabilities of the untempered rule of men from commanding states. More fundamentally, Tushakov's work shows how regulation cannot keep up with variegations of capitalism unless it is agile, innovative, relational. But somehow, that regulation must learn to temper domination better than it currently does. Hall and Soskis's research defined two varieties of capitalism. Very famous work, and both these varieties of capitalism are based on assemblages of national policies, including regulatory policies. Both varieties are successful capitalism. One is the liberal market capitalism of which the US and UK are lead examples. The second is the coordinated market capitalism of which Germany and Scandinavia are lead examples. I conceive these two capitalisms as 2 points that are relatively close together, not so different, along a wider continuum of variegated capitalisms. Afghanistan and Myanmar are much further along that continuum at the opposite end from these North Atlantic twin peaks of capitalism. The capitalism across the border from Myanmar in the poorer southwestern corner of China is closer to Myanmar capitalism than to Western Europe, while some of the great industrial capital regions further to the east of China are more like the European industrial capitalism of 60 years ago. At the same time, the information technology and national security state capitalism around Beijing is more like Silicon Valley and US national security state capitalism. There's also a massive agricultural capitalism in China. It's a hybrid of a feudal past, collectivisation, modern agribusiness and state-owned corporations. Business in some pockets of China is more privatised and experiences less Communist Party micromanagement. There are 11 free trade zones which have no direct customs, lower tax, less red tape, supposedly unfiltered internet approximating more liberal market conditions. Chinese financialisation by banks is in some ways even more massive than in the North Atlantic. Then there are the concentration camps, the work camps of Xinjiang province. The main point of all this is to say that variegation of capitalism within China is huge. While Chinese capitalism overall is authoritarian compared to the more liberal capitalism of the United States, these generalised tropes mask diversity too much. So I invite you to do your own thinking about how you would map the variegations of capitalism across space within the map of the United States. Variegation of capitalism is partly about the idea that many different capitalisms coexist in different spaces or different markets within one country. A more liberal market in this sector or space, a more coordinated market in another, a more authoritarian market somewhere else. While it's clear that it's important to see the variegation of capitalism and to be careful about sweeping tropes like neoliberalism as a description of America under the authoritarian rule of President Trump, it's also important to see how bits of the variegation become more globally interdependent. Americans might not approve of the corporations that provide them with cheap laptops, smartphones, by exploiting slave labourers in Congolese coltan mines. They may disapprove the exploitation of immiserated factory workers in Bangladesh that delivers their clothing brands. Yet they increasingly understand that their ability to purchase cheap clothing and smartphones and the profits in their pension funds depend on this. So they mostly look away from the symbiosis between neoliberal and authoritarian capitalism. They understand that the corporations that build their wealth prefer to manufacture in authoritarian countries, where they can pay local managers or Communist Party fixers to deal with the bribes to make labour law or environmental law go away. Liberal capitalism in this way digs its own grave and empowers authoritarian capitalism in its competition with it. Banks are hard to regulate because they own much of everything, including politicians. Banker power has a stronger interest than any other sector of the economy in holding down the wages share of national income. This is because the only way for policymakers to keep the economy growing when workers don't have enough money in their pockets to sustain demand and keep job growth clicking over, the alternative is policy settings that entice workers into deeper debt than they can sustain when times get bad. The more workers borrow, the higher the profits for banks. While unsustainable debt suits the banks, it's bad for the rest of us. And unsustainable debt is only good for the banks until the next crash comes. There are many definitions of the recent surge in the financialisation of capitalism. The next thing, I like Rudolf Hilfening's century-old definition of financialisation as increasing political economic power of banks and the rentier class. Financial profits as a share of US GDP have gone up very steeply. I'm sure older scholars have noticed it in their pension accounts, that back in the day you would have a lot of industrial companies in there. Now banks, financial institutions are much more important. But same in China. In the Forbes list of the most powerful corporations in the world for 2018, Communist Chinese banks occupy first place, biggest corporation in the world, second place, fifth, ninth and 10th place, and these are mostly state-owned banks. In honour of Martin Krieger, I would like to say something positive about financial regulators, which I don't do in all talks, but it was interesting to observe the Polish financial regulators' reactions to the global financial crisis. I mean, their reaction was to say, well, it's all very well for more sophisticated economies like the United States, United Kingdom, and for regulators in New York and London to be effective in monitoring these new forms of financial engineering, complex derivative products, but we're a less sophisticated economy. We can't understand them, or at least our banks can't understand them, because we throw out the challenge to our banks and say, if you can explain to us how these things work and what their risks are, and explain to us why the risk management systems you have in place to manage the risk will work, we'll fine. But we can't understand what you're telling us, and that's a very therefore, we're not going to extend your license if you're going to get into all of this stuff. And that's a very reasonable position for a regulator to adopt. And as it turned out, these decisions left Poland with banks less touched by derivatives trading than other European banks, with sliced and diced US subprime mortgages, and Poland recovered from 2008 with far higher growth than any other European economy. The other thing that's interesting about that Polish accomplishment of that time was that it used the hangover of its socialist system. It still had a large socialist state-owned bank, and in circumstances where the private banks were paralysed by a freeze on lending, they were able to instruct their still rather large public bank to lend like mad and get the Polish economy moving again. So that was, for Liberals, that was an interesting paradoxical feature of that Polish accomplishment. And it goes to why I worry about what will happen when China's big crash inevitably comes to it. I mean, my hypothesis is that China has such effective control of its banking levers and its authoritarian police state levers that the system might wobble a bit, and there will not be this another successful Tiananmen Square this time. Rather, the whole system will wobble very badly and they'll get it back on track in due course. Whereas an economy like Australia's and many other Western economies won't be able to cope with the crash of China and will go into a very desperate economic abyss which could bring it out the other side of that abyss with authoritarian capitalism, as we've seen in the rise of authoritarianism in other points in history. Many individual banks in not just the Polish regulators, but many individual banks in Canada, Australia, Asia, adopted the same humility, the same lack of hubris of the Polish regulators. Even at Lehman Brothers in the 2000s, there were a number of prominent, humble single bankers who thought the company was becoming too highly leveraged into too many derivatives that were not sufficiently transparent in their relationship to complex risks in real estate markets. These people were marginalised, with their views seen as a risk to short-run profits and bonuses. In some instances, they left because none of the big boys with big hubris were listening to their plans to temper, to their pleas to temper that hubris. It is the most sophisticated and aggressive, bonus-driven, liberal finance markets in New York and London that are the most difficult to temper. They pose the deepest global risks. Even within the United States, there are more and less aggressive, more and less innovative and risk-taking institutions. So in tempering banking power, one size cannot fit all as well. Responsive regulatory theory suggests that a relational species of regulation with a significant portion of restorative justice can be a helpful first port of call for strengthening the hand of temperate, ethical insiders before they are pushed toward the door. Reducing debt and increasing wages is the alternative that can make life better for poorer people while also more effectively proofing capitalism against crashes. Economists used to be almost as ambivalent as bankers about increasing the wages share of national income. Now, however, there's a considerable consensus among economists, and I'm now holding my breath, waiting for some economists in the audience to contest that. But I suspect there is a consensus among economists that the wage share of national income has fallen too far to reliably sustain job creation in the long run, especially when those inevitable shocks come back. Sustainable long-run demand that keeps unemployment shocks at bay require higher average wages than we see in economies like the United States. The best way to accomplish this with social justice is to increase minimum wages. This should also push up the incomes of those earning above the minimum wage as they demand a correspondingly higher salary to accord with their higher skill levels. Statistically, declining unionisation and declining minimum wages in the United States account for the majority of your wage inequality during rise in the past half century. A political strategy of raising minimum wages is the best way of ensuring that most of the benefit of a shift from the profit share to the wages share of national income would go to the poorest women and to poor women in particular. Securing this result is difficult without an internationalist struggle for a living wage that complements national policy and national campaigns. Shelley Marshall has brilliantly argued in her new book, which I think is also not quite out, You'll see it cited in the paper, which will be available to you. She's argued how such an international campaign for a global living wage might be conducted pragmatically and incrementally. Her strategy requires the trade union movement to reinvent its relevance. She suggests that unions shift from focus on national campaigns to a global social movement for wage justice. The centrepiece of the Marshall Strategy would be an International Labour Organisation agreement for signatory countries to increase their minimum wage each year. And it's not dependent on all countries being persuaded at once to join such a regime. The agreement would be to increase their minimum wages each year, with the countries with the lowest minimum wages agreeing to the highest annual percentage increases. Maybe that would be 2% in real terms per year. And the effect of that would be that after a number of years of the lowest minimum wage countries increasing their minimum wage 2% in real terms, 2% for a number of years, they would no longer be in the bottom group. They would move up to the higher group, and then someone else would be at the bottom. And that's how the ratchet would work, creating a new bottom group, which would be moved up as a signatory of the regime. Unions in wealthy countries would shift some of their resources to unions in very poor countries, so that those unions could support the campaigns of politicians who commit to increasing minimum wages in poor countries. Relatively modest contributions from unions in wealthy countries like the US and Germany could buy a great deal of political campaigning and worker political mobilisations in the world's poorest economy through the international union confederations. So might crowdfunding in rich countries. For unions in rich countries, this investment would be an indirect strategy for ratcheting up minimum wages in their own country. Marshall's global strategy is about workers of all countries helping one another to ratchet up minimum wages, and therefore the wages share of income across all countries. Each national success would help ratchet up minimum wages in all other nations. Once the campaign had succeeded in getting a critical mass of countries to sign up to the Global Living Wage Agreement, campaigning could shift from supporting political leaders who lead ratification campaigns to targeting holdouts and saboteurs of the regime who reduce minimum wages. Regime saboteurs would be targeted punitively on her scheme by consumer and union boycotts, fair trade decertification, strikes at multinational companies who invest in blacklisted low-wage countries, and a global fund to support strikers campaigning for a living wage in non-signatory low-income countries. Transnational corporations would be lobbied to sign a pledge to do business preferentially with suppliers and states on the living wage list. Marshall's strategy integrates innovative subnational approaches to improving labour standards and wages into global ratchets. Her approach allows locally responsive strategies to strengthen national safety nets and the national to strengthen the local. She argues that there are already incipient examples of this, such as the Asian Floor Wage Alliance. And other advocates of global justice strategies like Citizens for Tax Justice could learn from Marshall's and Meidinger's ideas about building positively a list of ally countries and firms before turning to more punitive global targeting via a blacklist of firms and countries. Should I go for another 5 minutes or come to a quicker conclusion? Okay, so I think constitutional law also has a place in tempering power. One approach to remedy I discuss is the ancient Chinese Confucian institution of an independent branch that regulates the executive government. This influenced constitutional thought of Sun Yat-sen. In Sun Yat-sen's Republic of China Constitution of 1928. This tradition was picked up in an innovative adaptation of Western Republican thought. That constitution provided for an extra semi-autonomous branch of governance called the Control Yuan. The Control Yuan was an elected branch until 1992 in Taiwan, and then it was an elected branch in Thailand when this model was implemented in its people's constitution in the 1990s. The fundamental thinking about the Control Yuan was that it would check, capture and abuse of power by regulatory agencies in the executive branch, but also check arbitrary power by the legislature and judiciary. Instead of allowing these branches to impeach their own wayward members, the Accountability and Integrity branch would independently adjudge impeachment. For the next constitutional revolution that occurs in a Western democracy, that accountability branch idea is not a bad idea. So in the Thai model, the things that get integrated, and the Taiwan model too, things like the General Accounting Office, the Ombudsman, Human Rights Commission, Anti-Corruption Commission, Independent Election Commission, and so on. And the mainstream, particularly the financial regulatory agencies. And it's particularly relevant for a contemporary West where financialisation has captured politics and the regulation of capital in a way that's dangerous for the sustainability of freedom. The job of an independent regulation of accountability branch is the regulation of the state, meta-governance, the governance of governance, to protect freedom from the hubris of arbitrary power. So in conclusion, financialisation creates an unjust society that refuses a fair share of the nation's wealth to those who earn their living from wages. This society burdens our children and grandchildren with debt, national and personal, more debt than is prudent. Institutional catastrophe may then open a door to crisis and authoritarianism. In the long term, we must learn to conquer this problem or it will conquer us. And authoritarian capitalism will continue to displace liberal capitalism to take over the world. Regulation, I hypothesise in summary, has more potential to be just and effective in response to the challenges of financialisation when it, one, is motivated by an explicit philosophy of tempering power and accountability that renders power less arbitrary, more compassionate and relational. Two, regulation tempers power more effectively when it is variegated to be responsive to the variegation of capitalism across space, time, sectors, firms. Three, power is more just when it is constitutionally meta-regulated for accountability and integrity of tempered power when it can escalate from relational justice to deterrent legal formalism. Four, finally, we must be more on guard against the risk that authoritarian capitalism will prove more sustainable than liberal capitalism for the challenge of steering demand without unmanageable debt and while paying adequate wages. Thank you. All right.
Well, let me start. Oh, there's, okay. You're up.
So I want to ask you about two concepts in that very rich lecture. So there are many, many things that one could ask about, and I assume that others in the audience will. But I wanted to ask a little more about two words being they
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally on the last question, there is a presupposition in the kind of Republican theory to which Philip Pettit and I subscribe, which is that good power would be power that reduces the amount of domination in the world. So it's about a Republican conception of freedom. So good power is power that increases freedom, where freedom is conceived as non-domination, as opposed to freedom conceived of just giving us more and more consumer choices. So that's the fundamental answer to that. But in the answers to all of your questions, I speak only as a disciple of greater minds, and one of those is here, Martin Krieger, and actually in his paper he addresses this issue of criteria for arbitrariness. So he can choose whether he wants to jump in and give a better, a more specific answer on that, or whether he'd prefer to save it for his paper presentation in the workshop. On the first part, yeah, I mean, Shearing, and particularly Shearing, is very, pretty much was at that time a Foucauldian scholar. So it was a Foucauldian take on taking his kids to Disney World. And in terms of the distinctions between, those were not mine, but Lawrence Lessig's, and he conceives as of three types of regulation. One is by legal sanctions, which is what we spend all of our time talking about, mainly in law schools. Another is by norms. We don't lie most of the time because we think it's shameful. And the other is by architecture. But I'll stick with the norms example because that illustrates more clearly, because norms become laws a lot of the time. And that's your point, that these things are mixed in together. And we're often but it's helpful to pull them apart, because I often say to my students that, most of us in this room have had some people do some horrible things to us this week, and when they did, we didn't think, I should bump that person off, shouldn't I? And we do that not because we think there's a law against it. We think that way because it's just unthinkable to us to kill other people. It's just right off our deliberative agenda, and that's because of the normative structure in our society rather than the legal structure in our society. So while these things do come together all the time, and we do write laws to require certain kinds of architecture and every which way, the distinctions are, I think, useful. Martin, did you want to take that invitation?
Thinking of framing more. And on arbitrariness, I won't take up time except to say that a kind of general statement of what arbitrariness is, the one you gave, without reasons or good reasons. But then if you think sociologically or politically, well, what are the sort of standard ways in which that can be subverted? One is when power holders aren't controlled. Another is when you don't know where it's coming from. That's the first thing is the common law tradition. The king can't do just what they like, there's a higher law. The second one is fuller, can't do it in the dark. And a third one, which Waldron has talked about, is law that treats people with respect. I take these not as definitions, but as instantiations of conditions whereby power is likely to be less arbitrary. And it covers quite a lot of ground.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. So I wish I would be the person that can just ask a question in one short sentence. I am not. Per Zumbansen from Osgood Hall Law School in Toronto. But given that we have all been looking so forward to, many of us finally meet you, like we've been reading you, but rarely you can actually meet the person in person. So that's why I want to ask a question that's sort of 2 sentences or 3 sentences. When you introduced Varieties of Capitalism, you did that in front of an audience that is mostly familiar with this and finds it normal to look to political economy and to the rich sociological account that they put forward in the early 2000s, which comes to rescue a law and society critique of financialization that took place in a lot of legal fields already at that time. But where do you see really the chances of this political economy intervention in current legal work back then, almost 20 years ago now, and today? And if one remembers how little impact varieties of capitalism had in the course of one field that was dominating so many discourse at that time, company law. Company law was one of the prime expressions of financialization. And company lawyers didn't care, they couldn't care less about varieties of capitalism. They didn't even know, many of them didn't know that this existed, the mainstream. All those that argued for shareholder value politics, they didn't know this differentiated critique. So I wonder just how could one make that stronger, and how could one infuse that critique today in the legal matrix, especially because the nature, as you said, of capitalism has changed so much. The rising of digital capitalism is so unexplored yet, and is basically in the hands of, you know, these pop lawyers now that move into AI and robot stuff, and the neoliberal labor lawyers that now write about AI and robotics. That's scary stuff. So how could we change that?
Yeah. Well, I skated over it too much. I mean, I do think it was a great contribution, because, you know, to go a little bit deeper into it, it shows that there's a sort of an assemblage of policies in how you run your capitalism. So Hall and Soska say that, I mean, well, they claim that in German society there's historically been weaker antitrust laws, so it's more possible for German firms in sophisticated engineering businesses to collaborate with each other. There have been historically stronger labour laws, so for companies like Mercedes-Benz to give their employees lifetime employment means that they've been able to retain higher quality workforces. So their variety of capitalism has been better at sophisticated engineering technologies than liberal capitalism, you know, particularly if you look at the UK, where those kind of industries were once the greatest throughout capitalism, but all collapsed very quickly, whereas they didn't in Germany. On the other hand, they inclined to argue that the German institutions are not that great for, you know, merchant banking, investment banking, because of this, you know, the culture of lifetime employment. What you want is, you know, crazy young people working as traders with ridiculous hours. You know, they sniff cocaine as well, don't they? And all that stuff, you know. German working conditions are more attuned to giving people security rather than saying you're out or you're getting no bonuses because you haven't been trading aggressively enough. So there's more that long-termism that hasn't returned those quick products that have been both the gift and the curse of American financial capitalism and British. So, you know, they both work, but in different ways and at different things, and therefore require different kinds of regulation. But my real point is to say that, look, they're still pretty alike, but regulating Myanmar capitalism is a very, very different challenge. Some have called it ceasefire capitalism, with banks that are totally insolvent and owned by figures with connections to the military and so on. Very different regulatory challenges.
Thank you. So I also have two, I'm Nimr Sultani, University of London. So I have two questions. They basically follow on Giora's points. So one is about power, which was a prevalent concept in your presentation, and one about democracy, which was absent from your presentation. With respect to power, I wonder what's your conceptualization of power. And I'm not asking here for definition, but I'm asking because I think different conceptualization of power will lead to different prognosis. So you say, I want to temper Wall Street. I want to contain Wall Street, whether formally or through compassion. But my question is, how does Wall Street become Wall Street? That is, how they possess that kind of power before they deploy it, and therefore we need to contain it and domesticate it and curb its excesses, etc. So that leads us to a different set of questions. And I think there are good reasons why for generations, political philosophers have not resolved the question, what is the line between arbitrary and non-arbitrary power, between the rule of law and the rule of men? And they did not resolve the paradox between constitutionalism and democracy, that is between containing the rule of the many and through rules, because the moment you draw meta rules, there is always the question, how do we resolve disagreements about these meta rules? And therefore, it's an infinite regress. And this is related to the question of democracy, because you mentioned republicanism briefly, but my concern about much of the republicanism literature in the last couple of decades is that it's a liberalized, de-radicalized version of Rousseau. So if you look at their justifications, they sound nice, and they talk about participation and the people's power of rebellion, but eventually they end up with the same kind of liberal institutional configuration. I even think that someone like John Rawls is more radical than someone like Philippe Petit, because John Rawls thinks that welfare capitalism, even though if it's tempered, is actually unjust, according to his theory of justice. So the question is, what does democracy play? What is participatory or democratizing the economy would mean to someone like, or to an entity like Wall Street and what it represents? Thank you.
Well, democracy is one way of tempering power, but not the only way. And we tend too much, I think, in these conversations to view democracy as, some kind of master trope and struggle for transformation, be it in places like Egypt and Tunisia that you have struggled, that getting democracy in place is the key thing, the key moment of transformation. And that increasingly looks like nonsense, as your own work also illustrates. But, so in the peace building business, we think we've really achieved something if we establish peace in Congo, and we really have. If we've just stopped the killing, that's important. But then we think the next big thing is to get elections held in the place and then pull out. Well, Libya is another interesting case in your work in that regard. But clearly, the elections that are held with the election monitors coming in and watching what's going on have done very little to reduce the dominations of Congolese societies. They're one thing that can help, but on their own, they're just democracy is too thin a reed, and it snaps. So one needs to build a fabric of modalities of tempering power. And you need to protect them, which is why I'm interested in the idea of a control branch which protects all of these institutions to some degree, particularly from executive government power and from business power and from bribery, which you've got a better chance of doing with politicians who are only allowed to serve one term in these, according to these constitutions, compared with politicians who have an interest in surviving. On the varieties of power, there are many varieties of power, and I think they're all useful and relevant to this analysis. So there is political power in a classic Dalian sense, and I was putting particular emphasis on financial power, the power to make decisions as to where the money will be invested and how much different kinds of people get paid. This worker versus that worker, women versus men, and so on. And there is Foucauldian power, many different kinds of governmentalities. There's convening power. And if we're thinking about a Foucauldian kind of architectural power, that's a relevant kind of power. That's been a kind of abuse of power, arbitrary power that's been very important in your society. One of the things I studied a long time ago was nursing home regulation in the United States. And a shocking statistic about aged care in the United States, I mean, a lot of your nursing homes were designed as panopticons, but also 42% of aged care residents in your nursing homes in the United States in the 1980s were tied up, were chains. And there were regulatory reforms in the early 1990s that untied your elderly. There was an inspiring social movement-led National Coalition for Nursing Home Reform campaign on Capitol Hill to untie the elderly. And it was one of those examples of compassionate regulation. There weren't a lot of nursing home proprietors put in jail, or many of them shut down, but dramatic change occurred there. A dramatic increase in freedom for the aged was accomplished when, in a short space of years, that number went down from 42% to 4%, and then has reduced a lot since, further since. So that there was architectural power, Foucauldian power, Foucauldian form of domination of aged care residents, and there was a social movement, normative response that then fed into a legal response in the exceptional case where a few aged care facilities had to be closed down in this state. But you've got to think about the different kinds of abuses of power that restrict freedom, and freedom is the key normative concept at the end of the day in this. And what are the levers that will deliver freedom for that kind of power?
Well, thanks for giving a lot of good food for thought here. So one of the questions that comes to my mind is what ideas or frameworks of thinking are part of the problem that I would say is of normalizing and sort of, normalizing untempered financial power particularly, but I think that we're in this position, in a state where it's not that people are openly campaigning for authoritarianism. I mean, there are those, but there are many that I think that would not have the danger that it has now without a lot of kind of strands of ideas within liberal capitalism that have lent themselves unconsciously or not, to reinforcing a sort of complicity with the rise of untempered power. And I would, in my work, I guess what strikes me as a constant refrain in sort of orthodox law and economics in the US in particular that says law can never be tempered power. The only tempered, non-arbitrary power that ever really works is the so-called free market. And so we have to justify deregulating, because regulators are always inevitably swayed by politics. That's the rational choice theory. Regulators and law always deals with imperfect human ability to process information. And so markets are the perfect information processors. Markets are the perfect temperers of power. So then, like with nursing homes, it's an interesting story. I think there was a news article recently that says there's a big increase of private equity ownership of nursing homes recently in many parts of the United States, and that has that financialization has led to a return of some of the abuses that that you mentioned. And part of that is that it reduces the whole running of a nursing home to a financial sort of system. But the rhetoric behind that is that the financial markets know best, and they will, better than regulators, be able to discipline and improve inefficient and, uncompassionate or unskilled or rent-seeking local actors that are creating abuses. So,
Yeah, well, Hayek was right on one bit, on the, markets being, better. States, especially big states in contemporary conditions, are a long way away from the ordinary lives of ordinary people, and when they try to put in place regulatory solutions, I mean, they don't, Hayek says they don't have enough local knowledge, and markets are much more attuned to local knowledge. But look what happened with the global financial crisis. You had Mr. Greenspan, your guy. He says, well, the banks wouldn't do things so stupid as to cause themselves to crash, would they? Well, I mean, we need to disaggregate those rational interests there. I mean, because of the short-termism of Wall Street, you see people moving in and out of banks and moving from one bank to another all the time. So the interest of the people who are in there running things and making the bonuses is to make a good killing on this and working for this bank, and then to move out before it crashes to put those bonuses somewhere else. And as we saw in that great movie, The Big Short, they can even short once they're out and on the road. They can even invest in shorting the crash of institutions, so they can even make money out of the crash. So the Hayekian analysis really falls down when you've got those paradoxes in the relationship between long-term survival of a business organisation and the short-term interests of rapacious people who work within them. So I think that's the answer to that one. But there are a few other questions probably along the way that I missed, but it was a good intervention. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Heather. Thank you very much. I have a question about the pragmatics of social advocacy across scale, and particularly around the living wage example, moving from the U.S. context. So the living wage movements in the U.S., I think, have fairly famously now been successful precisely by playing variegated forms of capital and across scale off of one another, right? So one of the reasons living wage has been so successful is because of a multi-scalar strategy, which increasingly is now focused on the local state and on municipal and more localized forms of regulatory regime. And so I guess I wonder, given the emerging success of that model, why the move to, or how do you understand the scale to, or the move to an international scale? So how does one take what's effectively a social advocacy strategy born of a particular diagnosis of a highly localized and multi-scalar regulatory regime, scale it to an international level? And is that really the sort of intervention that is worth investing in at this point in time? I mean, through what organizations and mechanisms would you even make that move?
Yeah, again, I'm just a disciple of Shelley Marshall. I'm not a labour law expert, but what she would say is that, yes, you do need an interscalar strategy, and the problem with contemporary trade union strategy in many Western countries, including our homeland Australia, is too much emphasis on a national strategy. And she would say, yes, you're right, more emphasis on a local strategy, and one of her case studies is an Australian local strategy. She also has an Indian one, a Bulgarian one, and one from somewhere else. I keep forgetting. And so she says, yes, be interscalar, don't totally ignore the national story, for sure, but invest more as a trade union movement in support, enabling local workers' efforts to negotiate local agreements that are attuned to the particularities of particular workplaces and what can be achieved there. That you're then factoring that into a more global and national interscalar, scaling up, ratcheting up of impact, and also later some ratcheting down of impact, but also invest more in this long-run international strategy. And one reason for that simply is that if you're the US trade union movement and you put $100,000 into supporting trade union development in Bangladesh to ratchet up Bangladesh minimum wages, it's a key frontier state in that kind of struggle, then that might be more strategic later on for those local initiatives to get even further. That would be the argument. Oh, Errol, you wanted to ask a question at the beginning. That's discriminatory. You can ask a question. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask a different question. I just returning to this question of whether authoritarian capitalism will eventually overrun or displace liberal and coordinated capitalism. Even as between the liberal and the coordinated capitalisms, one hears more and more that that liberal capitalism will be the long-run survivor because of its superior innovation capacity. And this university, for example, is betting that innovation is going to, technological innovation, organizational innovation, et cetera, are necessary long-term survival strategies. So I was just wondering, what's your take on the comparative survivability, innovative survivability of these different varieties of capitalism?
Yeah, I think those who say that are talking nonsense because, if you think of American examples, for example, you think of Dorfin Sable's work on the national security state in this country and how it works. How does it work? It works by the Pentagon deciding that we want to build a new kind of submarine, for example. And then what it does is it calls for tenders on those who might build the body of the ship. And different companies who do that will put in competitive bids, and then it'll call for tenders on, and that's a liberal market thing, okay? So what I'm saying is that the Pentagon is actually smart enough to be variegated in moving between liberal market capitalism and coordinated market capitalism in its own institution. And then it'll ask for bids on the weapons system for the submarine, and then on the IT systems from other kinds of companies. And then it'll look at all the bids coming in and say, why don't we marry this IT firm to this weapons system firm and get them to collaborate and produce some collaborative design. So they'll put together different collaborative groups, and then they're in the realm of coordinated capitalism, and they'll give them kind of German-style long-term guarantees that they will be able to get money from the Pentagon, bucket loads full of it, for a very long time, so that they'll be able to develop that sophisticated engineering capability, that long-term employment security, that liberal market capitalism does not normally guarantee. So in all of that, it feeds off that innovation system that comes from the university, but then it mixes and matches it between a market model of competition and a coordinated, collaborative model of how you get things done. And it brings universities into that stuff too.
Well, just a slight query here. Yeah, I think that's all true. That innovation is often coordinated, orchestrated by these entities with huge reach. The Baldy Center had a speaker recently, Michael Storper, a geographer from UCLA, who tried to explain the difference between the innovativeness in LA and the innovativeness in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I actually missed that presentation, but I did read the paper. I think his argument was that connections are very important and openness is very important. But I think he would argue that San Francisco was more innovative by being less controlled and just allowing happenstance interconnection. Now, Trina Hamilton's here, and she could clarify that argument, I think. But so I don't know. I'm not sure I think what you've said is okay.
Isn't Los Angeles more innovative in making movies?
Well, I guess you'd have to test. You'd have to say what counts as innovation. But in terms of, and I'm not capable of judging given how few movies I watch. But I think this question of leaving the texture open. I mean, and I'm a little surprised because it seems consistent to me with your idea of the importance of freedom as a societal value.
Well, yeah, but see, it might be that what you need for information technology excellence is different from what you need for movie making excellence, and the kind of regulatory assemblage around those urban nodes to maximise the innovation of output will be different. But people in Silicon Valley also talk a lot of nonsense about this. Bill Gates used to go on about how it was all his company that made these great breakthrough works and so on. But it was more fundamentally that Dorf and Sable kind of stuff. It was the internet being created by the Pentagon, working with the British defence establishment, deciding this was a good thing to build, and collaborating with university innovators in the United States and in the UK. Actually, Wi-Fi was invented in our hometown by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Organisation, totally serendipitously. So then they see that serendipitously happening in an obscure government organisation in Canberra, and they say, we can pick up on that and we can get Bill Gates or whoever to collaborate with that person. And it was that national security state which has delivered so much of the greatness of the US economy. And I don't want to downplay Bill Gates, but it's it's not all about them in the private sector by any means. A lot of the accomplishments of American capitalism are about socialist institutions like the State University of New York at Buffalo. Yep.
Hi, I'm Trina Hamilton. I'm a human geographer. And I just wanted to build on, I guess, what you just said, because my question was going to be about the limits of thinking through the lens of capitalism only. And especially on your living wage discussion, my thought was about not just transferring wealth in terms of adding to the wage, but also number of jobs. With mechanization and kind of roboticization, can liberal capitalism actually generate kind of economic justice with, I guess, these trends in mechanization and other ways of achieving economic growth and capital returns? So.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think you're right. I don't think so. I mean, I think particularly when we think of ecological collapse, we've got to change the shape of capitalism. I mean, I do think that if we want to keep people employed in future, we've got to have growth economies. So I'm all for capitalism in that very fundamental sense. But we've got to change the shape of capitalism so that more of those jobs that are creating that wealth are in the human services. So we need more jobs for teachers, more jobs for nurses, more jobs in universities. And these things are a good investment. You know, countries can borrow money to invest in universities at very cheap rates in contemporary conditions, and they can get a national return on investment to their GDP of about 8%. So it's like any business, you know, investing in universities and even going into deficit to build a better university system is a very good thing for states to do. And it's also a good thing because it creates a lot of jobs. So it fends off the concerns that you have through another path. Fundamentally, you know, what we've got to do if we're to avoid ecological catastrophe, which is the problem my paper did not address, but foreshadows is even more challenging and important, is to somehow sustain growth by having less of our growth being about buying more things, bigger houses, more cars, all that stuff that challenges the environment so devastatingly, and more of our growth being about providing more support through aged care, through our elderly people, more support through childcare for our children and teachers for our children in school and the like. People working in those jobs do not create more pollution. If our economy changes shape in that way, we can keep everyone very productively employed, creating a more just society. But the challenge will be a regulatory challenge of, and again, I think it's, you know, Citizens for Tax Justice who are pursuing the key strategies of what we need to do to collect more tax from footloose multinational corporations and from rich people for whom it's not mandatory to pay any tax. That's got to change so that we can fund those jobs. And that can be done. And some states do it better than others. So it's not mission impossible. Oh, we got one more. Yeah, last one.
Just because, so I guess I'm going to ask my questions again with more bluntly. What I meant to say, is capitalism the only alternative, and therefore is the only choice before us to temper power and temper capitalism and make it more humane, rather than thinking of alternative arrangements, redistributing wealth in society, rather than simply asking, how do we make Wall Street less greedy? So when Bush and Obama bailed out the banks, why wasn't nationalizing the banks?
Well, I think Gordon Brown's response in Britain as Prime Minister in the UK was a better one than Obama's response. That is to say, instead of bailing out the banks, Brown said, well, you know, we've given you X billion pounds, so now we own, you know, 63% of your shares, or whatever it was, and then to sell those shares for the benefit of taxpayers at a later time when the banks inevitably get back to super profits. So in that context, I'm all for socialism as part of the solution, but I think in due course, you know, taxpayers would be better served by selling off those banks in the long term and investing more state resources into teachers and nurses, but these are things that can be argued about. I was also a bit disappointed in the European Union that it didn't put in place a more socialist solutions re the ratings agencies, because basically you had, that business is dominated by two US ratings agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and really their conduct was outrageous. We have the emails internally showing what they were saying about how they would rate anything so long as their fees were being paid. So why didn't the European Union respond by saying, all right, we'll set up a public rating agency in Europe, and firms that want to be more credible in the market are going to come to the reputational capital that we're going to associate with that publicly owned European agency, and they would have attracted a lot of business from the US. So I think they were a bit dumb, in my view, that they didn't open their minds to that kind of socialist market opportunity that the US delivered up at that time. But I don't think any totalising socialist or capitalist solution is a good idea. I mean, I think we need societies with strong government, with strong markets, because these institutions can deliver different things. And there are a lot of things that can be much better delivered by markets than by states, as we saw with the experience of communism. But yeah. Speak up a bit, sorry.
Developed. I wanted to add in to the discussion the feminist political economists who've developed the language of diverse economies to talk about, these sorts of experiments with different iterations of markets and socialism and other forms of organization, rather than talking always about one or the other.
Yeah, and it's about socialism that offers contestation to capitalism, and capitalism that offers contestation to socialism, and that's one of the fundamentally structural ways of tempering power by my lights. Okay, thank you.